When Europe plunged into war in August 1914, America had shown no desire to get involved in the conflict. Although President Wilson had issued a proclamation declaring his nation's neutrality, there were nevertheless quite a few American citizens who had no intention of staying out of the Great War. Hundreds of American volunteers found their way to the war by either crossing into Canada and offering their services to Great Britain, or by buying their own passage and sailing to France, where they could enlist in that nation's service. These young men, drawn from all across the vast American continent, came to Europe for a variety of reasons. Some were motivated by a sense of idealism, believing the German war machine would, if left unchecked, eventually snuff out freedom on the continent. Others were driven by ancestral ties to Great Britain and France, and more than a few of the volunteers were simply adventurers, determined not to miss out on this war to end all wars. Of all the U.S. citizens who were to serve the Allied cause, none would capture the imagination of the public as completely as those who eventually came to form the Lafayette Escadrille. A handful of these young Americans had already been living in France at the onset of war. William Thaw had been working abroad as a salesman for an American firm. Bert Hall was making a modest living driving Parisian taxicabs, and James Bach was a mechanical engineer employed by a French company. Others had immediately sailed for France in the opening weeks of the war. In this group were Kiffin and Paul Rockwell, brothers from Asheville, North Carolina, Robert Suberin, a former race car driver, and Diedler Mason, already an experienced peacetime flyer. Some of these volunteers, wishing to get into action as quickly as they could, signed up with the French Foreign Legion. The Foreign Legion was a multinational group serving with the French, whose special status as mercenary soldiers would not jeopardize their citizenship in their home nations. Most of the Americans, however, found themselves serving in the American Ambulance Corps, an all-volunteer organization. Norman Prince, the privileged son of a wealthy Boston family, arrived in France in early 1915 and immediately offered himself to the French Air Service. Before leaving the United States, he had taught himself to fly airplanes at the Burgess Flying School in Marblehead, Massachusetts. The idea being that the French wouldn't hesitate to admit a trained aviator into its ranks. To his surprise, the French politely refused Prince's offer. There was the issue of America's neutrality, and besides, there was no shortage of French citizens volunteering for the air service. Prince was not to be put off so easily. In fact, he had an even larger idea that he began promoting to anyone who would listen, the idea of an all-American squadron serving the French effort. Although the idea was received with little enthusiasm by the French government, many of the American volunteers serving in the Ambulance Corps and the Foreign Legion embraced the concept of an all-American frontline unit. Prince continued to pester important officials and influential Americans living in France, until it was eventually agreed that the volunteers should be allowed to form their own escadrille. On April 18, 1916, the first American flyers reported to Luxeuil Airfield to begin serving in Newport 124, named the Escadrille Americaine. They were Victor Chapman, James McConnell, Norman Prince, Kiffin Rockwell, Bill Thaw, Elliott Cowden, and Bert Hall. Upon arrival at Luxeuil, the Americans were met by Captain George Thénault, the escadrille's commander. Luxeuil was situated in a quiet sector of the front. The pilots, housed in a large villa and taking their evening meals in the finest restaurants, began to feel more like holiday vacationers than aerial warriors, but Captain Thénault took the opportunity to drill the unit in the art of air fighting. They flew their first patrol, escorting bombers on May 13th, and 5 days later scored their first victory when Rockwell sent a German observation machine crashing to Earth. A day later, the Escadrille Americaine was ordered to Verdun and began operating from the airfield at Bayonne. The following day, Bert Hall downed a German over Verdun, and on the 24th it was Bill Thaw's turn, when he surprised an enemy fighter and killed its pilot. For all the hesitation the French government had shown, the idea of an all-American volunteer squadron seemed to be proving its value. On May 24th, a new volunteer reported to N124 for duty. Prior to joining the Escadrille, Raoul Loufberry's life had been a series of adventures. Born in France in 1885, to a French mother and an American father, Lufbery left France after the death of his mother and at the age of 19 set out to see the world. His travels took him all over Europe and Africa, where he worked at various jobs, including a waiter, deckhand, stevedore, and race car driver. Lufbery's travels eventually took him to America, where he hoped to find his father, who had settled in Wallingford, Connecticut. When Lufbery arrived, he learned his father had set sail for Europe just the day before. From Wallingford, the young adventurer traveled to New Orleans, Cuba, and then eventually San Francisco, where he joined the United States Army and was sent to the Philippines. In the Army, Lufbery quickly established himself as the best marksman in the division. 2 years later, after being discharged, Lufbery traveled on to Japan and then to China, where he worked for the Customs Service. In Bombay, India, he was employed as a ticketing agent for a shipping firm until his wanderlust carried him east to Saigon, where he saw his first airplane. The famous French stunt pilot, Marc Porp, had been traveling through Asia giving demonstrations with a Blériot monoplane, and he and Lufbery hit it off at once. Signing on as Porp's airplane mechanic, the pair continued traveling through the Orient and eventually on to Egypt, where Lufbery followed the flyer down the Nile as far as Khartoum, traveling by boat, raft, train, camel, donkey, and sometimes on foot. In the summer of 1914, Lufbery and Porp returned to France with the intention of buying a larger airplane, but their plans for further travel were suddenly cut short by the declaration of war. Porp immediately enlisted in military aviation. Lufbery, after first serving as a foot soldier in the Foreign Legion, later joined Porp in Escadrille MS-23, where he served as his friend's mechanic once again. This pairing was only to last for a short time. Porp was killed that December, and the grief-stricken Lufbery, vowing to avenge his friend's death, managed to secure a posting to the flight training school at Chartres. For any aspiring French airmen, the training experience began with penguins, Blériot monoplanes with wings clipped short. Unable to leave the ground, the students would learn to race these odd machines back and forth across a large field. When they were able to traverse in a straight line, they would be moved on to the next stage of their training, Blériots with full-size wings but underpowered engines. These would allow them to get a few feet airborne in short hops. Next would come the regular Blériots, on which the hopeful pilots would learn the rudiments of flying, and those who qualified would finally pass on to the advanced training schools, where they would master the mysteries of stunt flying and aerial gunnery. Raoul Lufbery easily passed through the training schools, and he was posted to a bombing squadron where he flew the lumbering Voisin bombers. After hearing rumors of an all-American escadrille that had been formed, Lufbery applied for and was granted a transfer to the unit. Once he arrived at Bayonne, he quickly established himself as both one of the squadron's most colorful characters and its premier combat flyer. Before long, Lufbery would emerge as the escadrille's greatest star, eventually downing 17 German aircraft.